The Little Shepherd of Kingdom Come by John Fox Jr. Chapter 7, A Friend on the Road. Rain fell that night, gentle rain and warm, for the south wind rose at midnight. At 4 o'clock, a shower made the shingles over Chad rattle sharply, but without waking the lad. And then the rain ceased. And when Chad climbed stiffly from his loft, the world was drenched and still, and the dawn was warm. For spring had come that morning, and Chad trudged along the road unchilled. Every now and then he had to stop to rest his foot. Now and then he would see people getting breakfast ready in the farmhouses that he passed, and though his little belly was drawn with pain, he would not stop and ask for something to eat, for he did not want to risk another rebuff. The sun rose, and the light leaped from every wet blade of grass and bursting leaf to meet it, leaped as though flashing back gladness that the spring was come. For a little while Chad forgot his hunger and forgot his foot. Like the leaf and grass blade, his stout heart answered with gladness too, and he trudged on. Meanwhile, far behind him, an old carriage rolled out of a big yard and started toward him and toward Lexington. In the driver's seat was an old gray-haired, gray-bearded Negro with knotty hands and a kindly face, while on the oval-shaped seat behind the lumbering old vehicle sat a little darky with his bare legs dangling down. In the carriage sat a man who might have been a stout squire straight from old merry old England, except there was a little tilt to the brim of his slouch hat that one never sees except on the head of a Southerner. And in his strong but easy, good-natured mouth was a pipe of corncob with a long cane stem. The horses that drew him were a handsome pair of half-thoroughbreds, and the old driver, with his eyes half closed, looked as though even that early in the morning he were dozing. An hour later, the pike ran through an old wooden-covered bridge, to one side of which a road led down to the water, and the old Negro turned the carriage to the creek to let his horses drink. The carriage stood still in the middle of the stream, and presently the old driver turned his head. "Massa Call," he called in a low voice. The major raised his head, and the old Negro was pointing with his whip ahead, and the major saw something sitting on the stone fence, some 20 yards beyond, which stirred him sharply from his mood of contemplation. "Shades of Daniel Boone," he said softly. It was a miniature pioneer, the little still figure watching him solemnly and silently. Across the boy's lap lay a long rifle. The major could see that it had a flintlock, and on his tangled hair was a coonskin cap. The scalp above his steady dark eyes, and the tail hanging down the lad's neck. And on his feet were moccasins. The carriage moved out of the stream, and the old driver got down to hook the check reins over the shining bit of metal that curved back over the little saddles to which the boy's eyes had swiftly strayed. Then they came back to the major. "Howdy," said Chad. "Good morning, little man," said the major pleasantly, and Chad knew straight away that he had found a friend. But there was silence. Chad scanned the horses and the strange vehicle and the old driver and the little Negro boy who, hearing the boy's voice, had stood up on his seat and was grinning over one of the hind wheels. And then his eyes rested on the major with a simple confidence and an unconscious appeal that touched the major at once. Are you going my way? The Major's nature was too mellow and easygoing to pay any attention to final G's. Chad lifted his old gun and pointed up the road. I'm a-going that-a-way. Well, don't you want to ride? Yes, he said simply. Climb right in, my boy. So he climbed in, and holding the old rifle upright between his knees, he looked straight forward in silence while the Major studied him with a quiet smile. Where are you from, little man? I come from the mountains. The mountains? Said the Major. The Major had fished and hunted in the mountains, and somewhere in that unknown region he owned a kingdom of wild mountain land, but he knew as little about the people as he knew about the Hottentots, and cared hardly more. What are you doing up here? I'm going home, said Chad. How did you happen to come away? Oh, I've been wanting to see the settlements. The settlements, echoed the Major, and then he understood. He recalled having heard the mountaineers call the bluegrass region the settlements before. I come down on a raft with Dolph and Tom and Rube and the squire and the school teacher, and I got lost in Frankfort. They've gone on, I reckon, and I'm trying to catch 'em. What will you do if you don't? Follow 'em, said Chad sturdily. Does your father know down in the mountains? No, said Chad shortly. The Major looked at the lad gravely. Don't little boys down in the mountains ever say sir to their elders? No, said Chad. No, sir, he added gravely, and the Major broke into a pleased laugh. The boy was quick as lightning. I ain't got no daddy and no mammy. I ain't got nothing. It was said quite simply, as though his purpose merely was not to sail under false colors, and the Major's answer was quick and apologetic. Oh, he said, and for a moment there was silence again. Chad watched the woods, the fields, and the cattle, the strange grain growing about him, and the birds and the trees. Not a thing escaped his keen eye, and now and then he would ask a question which the Major would answer with some surprise and wonder. His artless ways pleased the old fellow. You haven't told me your name. You ain't axed me. Well, I ax you now, laughed the Major, but Chad saw nothing to laugh at. Chad, he said. Chad what? Now, it had always been enough in the mountains when anybody asked his name for him to answer simply Chad. He hesitated now, and his brow wrinkled as though he were thinking hard. I don't know, said Chad. What? Don't know your own name? The boy looked up into the Major's face with eyes that were so frank and unashamed, and at the same time so vaguely troubled, that the Major was abashed. Of course not, he said kindly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world that a boy should not know his own name. Presently, the Major said reflectively, Chadwick. Chad, corrected the boy. Yes, I know. And the Major went on thinking about Chadwick, that Chadwick happened to be an ancestral name in his own family. Chad's brow was still wrinkled. He was trying to think what old Nathan Cherry used to call him. I reckon I ain't thought of my name since I left old Nathan, he said. Then he told briefly about the old man, and lifting his lame foot suddenly, he said, Ouch! The Major looked around, and Chad explained, I hurt my foot coming down the river, and it got worse walking so much. The Major noticed then that the boy's face was pale, and that there were dark hollows under his eyes, but it never occurred to him that the lad was hungry, for in the Major's land nobody ever went hungry for long. But Chad was suffering now, and he leaned back in his seat and neither talked nor looked at the passing fields. By and by he spied a crossroads store. "I wonder if I can get something to eat in that store." The Major laughed. "You ain't getting hungry so soon, are you? You must have eaten breakfast pretty early." "I ain't had no breakfast, and I didn't have no supper last night." "What?" shouted the Major. Chad stated the fact with brave unconcern, but his lip quivered slightly. He was weak. "Well, I reckon we'll get something to eat there, whether they've got anything or not." And then Chad explained, telling the story of his walk from Frankfort. The Major was amazed that anybody could have denied the boy food and lodging. "Who were they, Tom?" he asked. The old driver turned. "They was some poor white trash down on the Cane Creek, I reckon, sir. Must have been." There was a slight contempt in the old Negro's words that made Chad think of hearing the Turners call the Dillons white trash, though they never said po white trash. "Oh," said the Major. So the carriage stopped, and when a man in a black slouch hat came out, the Major called, "Jim, here's a boy who ain't had anything to eat for 24 hours. Get him a cup of coffee right away, and I reckon you've got some cold ham handy." "Yes, indeed, Major," said Jim, and he yelled to a little girl who was standing on the porch of his house behind the store. Chad ate ravenously, and the Major watched him with genuine pleasure. When the boy was through, he reached in his pocket and brought out his old $5 bill, and the Major laughed aloud and patted him on the head. "You can't pay for anything while you were with me, Chad." The whole earth wore a smile when they started out again. The swelling hills had stretched out into gentler slopes. The sun was warm, the clouds were still, and the air was almost drowsy. The Major's eyes closed, and everything lapsed into silence. That was a wonderful ride for Chad. It was all true, just as the schoolmaster had told him. The big, beautiful houses he saw now and then up avenues of blossoming locusts, the endless stone fences, the whitewashed barns, the woodlands and pastures, the meadowlarks flitting in the sunlight and singing everywhere, fluting, chattering blackbirds, and a strange new blackbird with red wings at which Chad wondered very much as he watched it balancing itself against the wind and singing as it poised. Everything seemed to sing in that wonderful land, and the seas of bluegrass stretching away on every side, with the shadows of clouds passing in rapid succession over them like mystic floating islands, and never a mountain in sight. What a strange country it was. "Maybe some of your friends are looking for you in Frankfort," said the Major. "No, sir, I reckon not," said Chad, for the man at the station had told him that the men who had asked about him were gone. "All of them?" asked the Major. Of course, the man at the station could not tell whether all of them had gone, and perhaps the schoolmaster had stayed behind. It was Caleb Hazel, if anybody. "Well, now, I wonder," said Chad. "The school teacher might have stayed." Again the two lapsed into silence, Chad thinking very hard. He might yet catch the schoolmaster in Lexington, and he grew very cheerful at the thought. "You ain't told me your name," he said presently. The Major's lips smiled under the brim of his hat. "You ain't asked me." "Well, I ax you now." Chad, too, was smiling. Cal, said the Major. Cal what? I don't know. Oh, yes, you do. Now you fooling me. The boy lifted one finger at the Major. Buford, Calvin Buford. Buford, 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 repeated the boy each time with his forehead wrinkled as though he were trying to recall something. What is it, Chad? No, nothing. And then he looked up, bewildered face at the Major, and broke into the quavering voice of an old man. Chad Buford, you little devil, come here this minute, or I'll beat the life out in you. What? Said the Major excitedly. The boy's face was as honest as the sky above him. Well, that's funny, very funny. Well, that's it, said Chad. That's what old Nathan used to call me. I reckon I ain't never thought of my name again till you axed me. The Major looked at the lad keenly and then dropped back in his seat, ruminating. Way back in 1778, a linchpin had slipped in a wagon on the Wilderness Road, and his grandfather's only brother, Chadwick Buford, had concluded to stop there for a while and hunt and come on later. Thus ran an old letter that the Major had in his strong box at home, and that brother had never turned up again, and the supposition was that he had been killed by Indians. Now, it would be strange if he'd wandered up in the mountains and settled there, and if this boy were a descendant of his. It would be very, very strange, and then the Major almost laughed at the absurdity of the idea. The name Buford was all over the state. The boy had said with amazing frankness and without a particle of shame that he was a waif, a woods colt, he said, with paralyzing candor. And so the Major dropped the matter out of his mind, except insofar that it was a peculiar coincidence, again saying, half to himself, "It certainly is very odd." End of chapter 7.